What should we talk about? You have something on your mind?
Oh, too much. No.
Too much. Yeah.
Always. No. Thursday night, since I was not there, did you continue with the creation of?
I didn't really even get as far as I had last Sunday, but I did begin to speak about taking the approach of soul creation, instead of just soul negation.
I would like to have you continue on that, if you would, please.
I certainly intend to, and I will. And so, anybody have any thoughts on that particular topic?
S-O-L-E or S-O-U-L?
What's that?
Is it S-O-L-E or S-O-U-L?
Well, actually, in the deepest analysis, they are the same.
Okay.
Because the greatest ill that we suffer is the illusion of separateness. And the idea of an S-O-U-L is a desperate attempt, while still clinging to that separateness, to find some sort of consolation. But the only real consolation comes with abandoning the S-O-L-E. So, and that's... were you here last Sunday? No, you weren't here last Sunday. So, if we look at how psychologically and philosophically the self or the soul is identified, there are certain characteristics that are implicit assumptions whenever we think or talk about the self or soul, and they are that it has a characteristic of unity, that there's only one, that I have only one soul and you have only one soul. Not that there are many different souls inhabiting each of us. The second is the characteristic of sameness or endurance, although often that gets translated into permanence too. We think of it as being eternal or perpetual. But even for those that don't, they still, the idea is, I am the same self that I always was, and I will continue to be this same self, if not forever, then at least until I die. So that's another thing. And then the third defining characteristic is that myself or soul is somehow distinct from, readily distinguishable from, separate from, and somehow independent of everything else. So those are sort of the implicit ideas that the mind spontaneously generates and attaches to the idea of self or soul, either one. And so when we look closely at them, we find that all of these are without substance. But it's the third that is really, as I said, that's the most fundamental problem, is that we perceive ourselves as being separate from what is not self. And so, in order to engage in a process of healthy soul creation, we need to distinctly modify that sense of separateness. There's the feeling of separateness, and then there is the product of our cognitive activities and our discursive thought activities and everything that create an objective self in the mind. So there's that deep, inherent, and very difficult to transcend sense of separateness and isolation. But we can distinguish that from, and we might just call it the experience of separateness, we can distinguish that from what happens when, once that's there, we go through this whole process of self-identification, and self becomes an object, the object idea of who we are and what we are. And that's, as soon as we create that object, it has a lot of immediate consequences. We now have, that object can be attacked or demeaned, and that produces a very strong reaction. And that object has needs, amongst them is to be protected, but also there is a need, it seems to always need to be nourished and expanded and so forth. And that's the ego self. And so, in terms, and of course, normally for us, the ego self and this inherent sense of separateness are so intertwined that it's difficult to distinguish between them. But one of the most important things that we can work on doing is recognizing the conditioned, transitory, unreliable, constantly changing nature of this, the totally illusoriness of this objectified ego self, and realize that at its root, all it is a mental function that serves a very useful daily purpose. You know, I like to say it helps us keep our laundry separate from somebody else's. You know, you picture yourself going through the laundry, okay, that's my socks, that's not my shirt, that sort of thing. This identification of who we are, and it helps us to function in the world. But if we realize that's all it is a mental function that has a pragmatic purpose in daily life, but nothing else to it, and realize and instead at the level of the way that we actually view our body and mind in relation to everybody else is more one of unity and oneness. So to begin getting beyond that characteristic of separation or separateness that we believe in so deeply and we feel to be the truth, that is actually at the root of all of our problems. So the soul that we would like to create is one that identifies itself as a part of a whole and not really distinguishable from that whole, and that rather than an ego self whose needs are constantly putting us in conflict with other people and with our environment, we're always trying to manipulate the world to meet the needs of the ego self and to protect the ego self, and it creates this continuing stress and struggle, and we're always evaluating the success or failure of that process, and then also inevitably we get into things of evaluating our ego self and have enter into processes of experiencing either arrogant and highly egocentric behaviors, or we go the other way and begin to experience loss of self-esteem and a feeling of worthlessness and pointlessness, and seeing our self as being flawed or at fault. So, and when you move, of course, most of us tend to move back and forth between those. You know, sometimes we're arrogant and are ego is in a place of seeing its own superiority, which is one kind of conceit. And then other times we plunge down to the other end and we see ourselves as inadequate and lacking and inferior and less than others. And of course that's another kind of conceit. So this is the problem with identifying self the way that we ordinarily do, and having the sense of separateness and the objectified view of who we are completely intermixed. So we can eventually modify both of those. We can see through both of those illusions. But the inherent sense of self is a much more deeply embedded. It operates at an unconscious level, and it takes a lot longer to get at that. But we can come to recognize the nature of the ego self and have our identification with that fall away much easier. And we can do that through recognizing and coming to a place of understanding and experiencing unity with everything else. And so that's how we overcome the SOLE, is to just begin recognizing that. And there's an intellectual part to it. We can analyze this. And I think that's really important. It may be more important for some people than others, but I think it's helpful for absolutely everyone to think about what, who they think they are and what that really is composed of, and try to identify it, and try to see if they can find anything that even vaguely resembles a substantial self the way they objectify it. And of course, if you think you do, examine it more closely and see what happens. And then also to examine very realistically and very rationally how much sense that makes, especially in terms of what we do know about the world and life and everything else. That's the beginning, I think, or at least it's a very helpful aspect to getting beyond this attachment to the ego self. It's just to really, through actually having thought about it and examined and looked, to begin to see what an inadequate perception this is and how ungrounded it is. And then the other part is that goes along with this is to just reflect and examine and realize how totally interconnected we are. How and not just with other human beings or with other living beings, but with absolutely everything that is. And how arbitrary the distinction is between self and other. And even to notice how in our daily lives that imaginary line or membrane that separates self from other expands and contracts and goes out further in that direction and shifts around. It is purely to discover how purely a product of the mind that the whole notion of self and who I am really is. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the qualities of that experience? We all know that suffering comes from the small sense of self. Can you talk about what's beyond that?
Well, what falls away first, what we overcome, is that attachment to ego self. And really, the ego self essentially after a while just isn't there anymore. There's still the mental function that allows you to sort your laundry and take care of your affairs, but you don't experience that ego self anymore. But you still have the sense of of the self in a more profound sense, and sometimes it's the true self, or the self with a big S, or the, there is that experience of being one with everything. As the ego self falls away, what you have, it's replaced by the sense of being at one with everything, and being in a place of acceptance with everything. That instead of, you see, prior to that, the ego self is really the focal point and the center of reference for all of our activities. But when that falls away and we experience a more unified sense, then rather than the well-being of the perceived self, the well-being of the whole, and to the degree that there's a new sort of moral compass. It's no longer based on a concept that thou shalt not cause harm to others, but recognizing that we're all the same self, and that the harm that you cause to others is harm that you cause to yourself. And so it ceases to be an ethic in the normal sense, but rather just a logic of behavior.
I'm talking about more from the heart.
From the heart?
Yeah. Can you talk more about how that feels?
It feels.
That's what we're all looking for.
It feels really good, because you see the other people that you see. There's something that we all do anyway. We become really close to another person, and we expand our definition of self to include that other person. If we have children, we'll expand the definition of self. For a parent, and especially for mothers, there's hardly a distinction between, their personal self and the self, and the idea of self that includes their children. So, from the heart, you start. Everybody is like your beloved. Everybody is like your children. There's this. On the one hand, I'm still separate from you, but on the other hand, we're the same, and you're, in terms of my selfhood, the experiences in terms of my selfhood, you're a part of it, the same as a child is to a mother, or the beloved is. And the same thing with the world. I mean, on a beautiful day like this, when you feel at one with everything, then your only role is to be the appreciator and the wonder of the beauty of what is. And when things are going very much the other way, there is a sense of acceptance and surrender that even though you may not be able to as clearly and directly perceive the beauty and wonder of it, you know that even when things are going badly, that it's still perfect in the same sense it is when you're doing a walking meditation on a beautiful day like today. So, and that's actually why there's so much less suffering and pain, is because there's less resistance. There's not this distinction between the self and the others, and the boundary is this area where everything is going wrong. Because actually that is, whatever is happening is what's happening, And it's only at the boundary between the perceived self and what's happening that the judgment occurs that, oh, this is a beautiful day, or this is a terrible cataclysm that's happening. So the more that boundary and distinction dissolves, then the less experience that you have. And the wonderful thing about it is that the stress of resistance falls away. But that doesn't mean that the appreciation, the wonder, doesn't fall away. As a matter of fact, it has just the opposite effect. It opens you up to it more. So that instead of, oh yeah, that's nice, and back to the things I'm worried about that are, satisfying the needs of this self. Because you see, that's the problem that we mostly have in the world, is the beauty and wonder that's present gets just barely acknowledged, and then we're diving back into, and we feel like we have to, because this self is so filled with needs that we don't have more than a moment to spare for the wonder of what it is to be a sentient being in this world. So without that, we are so much more open to the magnificence of what we really are. All we are is a point of consciousness that is an opportunity to know and experience part of this, the limited part of this magnificence that is what we occupy. That's what you were getting at? Yeah. Okay. Does have these other dimensions too, as a dimension of morality as well, as I started to mention, things like that. So, but the key to it, the key to the whole thing is, and it happens gradually by stages, and sometimes you experience it more strongly than others. But it's really a deep intuitive recognition of what, if you think about it a little bit at all, is incredibly obvious. And that's the thing that is so amazing about it, is it is so obvious. It is so easy to understand, yet it's so difficult to see the world and live from that place. And that's why we have all these practices and everything else to try to get us to the place of, having the right view, which is basically knowing the way things really are. Yeah.
It seems, as I think about it, that there can be no liberation from me and mine without service. That service is absolutely the outgrowth of relinquishing
Yeah.
of a sense, a real strong ego-centered self, because service involves compassion, of giving, and if one stays inside one's doors and even just takes care of one's bodily needs and is practicing egolessness, or contemplating that and so on, you can only go so far without service.
That's true. And I'll point out something to you about this. When we deliberately engage in service, as service, what we're doing is we're practicing we're practicing the behavior that corresponds to the state of being that we aspire towards. To the degree that we succeed in attaining that state of being, of experiencing the unity, the quality of service changes from being something that we deliberately do, conceiving as service, as to being what we naturally do because there really isn't anything else to do. So, and this is the way with all the practice of the breath. You practice generosity as a deliberate behavior in imitation of the kind of being you wish to become, for whom it is just a natural, spontaneous way of being. And likewise, patience, and loving kindness, and compassion, the intentional practice of these bringing us towards it's one of the ways by which we actually bring ourselves to attain the goal that we're trying to achieve. And so yes, service is very important, and the perfection of generosity goes very much into the area of service. Superficially, it may be seen as giving material things, giving money and things like that. But generosity means really freely giving all of those things, any of those things, which are normally the object of your own desires. So there are times that you need somebody else's time and energy, so you give your time and energy to others wherever you see that same need is present. Being the kind of emotional human beings that we are, we need respect, love, acceptance, various kinds of affirmation. And so the practice of generosity also means freely giving that to others. Learning not to miss the chance of telling somebody what a great job they did, or how nice they look today, or whatever it happens to be. So, as you can see, inevitably the practice of generosity means recognizing in others the same needs that you've experienced in yourself, and freely doing whatever you can to help meet those needs. And that is service. And of course, you can go to the slums of Calcutta like Mother Teresa and do it that way, or you can remain in the marketplace of Tucson and just practice it at every opportunity you have. Each of us may have our own need for the dramatic component of the service that we engage in, but nobody in any situation anywhere is lacking in the opportunity to practice generosity and to be of service.
In all the Dharma talks that I've heard you give, and so on, it seems like all roads lead to compassion.
Yes. Well, you see, compassion is an inevitable outcome of realizing the truth, which is the illusoriness of the separateness that we experience. So, true compassion, the deepest compassion, arises in proportion to the degree that we've understood that. But, before we have any real deep understanding and experience of that, there is still a facsimile of compassion that we're all capable of. Because we can all see ourselves in others. And so, by virtue of the fact that we can see ourselves in others, we can respond to others as ourselves. So we all inherently already have the seeds of this compassion present and in a fully operable form, even before we have, even before we've heard anybody mention any of these things that I'm talking about.
Culadasa, a struggle that I have is, you said giving someone something like saying that they look nice or that they've done a good job. When someone tells me I look nice, that pulls me into my ego.
Yes.
When someone tells me I've done a good job, that pulls me into my ego. And I don't feel they're seeing the true me, the I. They're seeing the me, which is the illusion that I'm trying hard to not be bound in myself and blinded by. So in a way, it feels like it's not a gift when someone acknowledges those things in me, because it inadvertently goes to strengthen the part of me that's interfering with my true contact with myself and with others. It's not how they look, it's not what they do, it's that they are. Can you speak to that? I have confusion.
Yes. Well, first of all, when you are interacting with another person, you don't necessarily know where they're at in terms of this process and their understanding. And if you went through the world saying, well, because I feel this way, the way you just described, I'm not going to compliment anybody else. I'm not going to acknowledge their successes. I'm not going to, I'm not going to recognize the positive qualities that they manifest, because I'm doing them a favor by not feeding their ego. That wouldn't be very good.
No,
that's really obvious.
Yeah, I mean it toward me.
Yeah, right.
I do it to others.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, so you see, you're doing it to others, and now you don't know, but they may or may not be experiencing the same thing you do. So all that you can really do, you see, is hope that they're doing the same thing which hopefully you are doing yourself, which is practicing mindfulness. So somebody says, to tell you the truth, you are a really good-looking guy, and from the first time that you came into my meditation classes, I thought, that is a very, sleek-looking, handsome, he carries his age well. That's an interesting man. So I tell you that, and you feel your ego arise, and if you're mindful, you say, there's the ego, and you recognize that my appearance is just due to causes and conditions, and there's nobody in here to take credit for it. So, so how should I look at this? Well, it's really nice to know that I'm not a blight on other people's vision. So that's what you want to do, is practice mindfulness. Somebody comes up to me and says, I really liked what you said tonight. It was a great talk. Well, instead of I sure am a good teacher. It's like, I feel really pleased to know that I was able to speak to something that somebody needed to hear. And it has a positive effect on me. It energizes and encourages me, and it helps me it actually makes me want to try harder to do even better in the future. And so there's no harm done. Right? So if a person is still in the place of totally being unaware, and they take every compliment as a boost to their ego and self-esteem, you can't really help that. But when they're in that place, to some degree, they need it. I mean, there is a common perception that we have that when somebody is manifesting a lot of egocentric, self-centered pride, that they need to be put down and brought back to reality. But if you think about the times when you've manifested that, it's not really the truth. The times that you are most solid in yourself, you're not very likely to get into that self-centered, prideful state. It's when you're in a state of vulnerability and doubt, and then something comes along that allows you to be prideful. And so it's like you're holding yourself up, but on this really, really narrow, little, fragile pole. And the last thing you need is somebody to come along and knock it out from under you. Okay?
Which just makes us want to make it stronger anyway.
That's right. Yeah. We just we react, and we react as though it was a physical assault. We start to fight for our lives then, right?
Or a sense of self.
Yeah, for a sense of self. Yeah. So just whenever the world in any form gives you positive feedback, like there's a task you need to accomplish and you feel satisfied that I've done a good job, that's as much feedback from the world as when somebody comes along and pays you a compliment verbally. So whenever the world gives you positive feedback, then you just take that in and convert that energy to continuing to try to be of service and
Thank you.
contribute to the whole.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Well, anybody else have any comments? Questions?
Well, I think you were talking about the soul creation last time as a counterpart to our getting the feeling of I don't have any self, I don't have anything, I'm nothing, there's nothing, the despair of feeling like everything is empty and there's nothing. I think that's what you started out last time to give us a more positive way of, getting through those times when you feel like, well, what's the use of anything because there's nothing and I'm nothing and, why am I alive?
That is, yes, that is right. Because our options are we stay completely mired in delusion, or we confront the truth, we confront the reality that is our existence. And if we all, there is a dark night of the soul, as John of the Cross called it, or the dukkha jnanas, the knowledges of suffering that is described in ancient Buddhist text called the Visuddhimagga. And there's the stages in there's the second of the 5 paths. I can't remember. I believe it's called the stage of heat, but I don't remember. Is anybody the stages of the second path? Do you remember what those are?
Talking about accumulation, preparation,
Yeah.
seeing.
In the path of preparation, there's described a series of stages, and one of them is just it's this miserable state, the same as the knowledges of fear, misery, and disgust in the progress of insight, and the same as the dark night of the soul in John of the Cross. It doesn't really matter. I think it's called the stage of heat, but I might be wrong. I don't have that good a memory for some things. But this is what happens when you start to give up your cherished illusions, and as they fall away, there's a tendency to come into a place of despair. With the death, with the falling away, which is a kind of death of the ego self, the sense of unity doesn't immediately rush in to fill the void. And first there is just that feeling of meaninglessness and emptiness, and I'm nothing but this accidental phenomenon that has happened in a meaningless mechanical universe, and I'm just here long enough to suffer and then I'm gone. And that's a very nihilistic view. As a matter of fact, that is the view called nihilism. And it does lead to, there is a kind of nihilistic philosophy that arises out of that, which basically says, if life is absolutely meaningless, and there's no point, there's no hope, there's no God, there's no soul, then I might as well do whatever I want and make myself as happy as I can in the present. And so this is the philosophy, and I don't mean this in a generic form. This is a specific philosophies of nihilism. If you look up nihilistic philosophy, this is what you'll find. This is the logical conclusion of this way of thinking and of this discovery, is that since everything is meaningless, you create your own meaning. So, what the heck? It's all empty, and since it's empty, I'll make it be whatever I want it to be. That's what led to the Third Reich, directly. That's what leads to all kinds of cases of various kinds of abuse of people. It is, a lot, the cult spiritual leaders that create such scandals because of the suffering they inflict on the people that follow them. They've reached the point of the dark night of the soul, and their logic has led them into the nihilistic philosophy. Well, this is all there is. Everything's empty, then I might as well do whatever I want and be whatever I want and sleep with whoever I want and have as many Mercedes-Benz as I feel like, and everything else, right? So rather than trust to go through the dark night of the soul successfully and come to the place of the true falling away of the ego self and place of unification, let's begin with the end in mind. Let's have a real clear idea of what the alternative is. If you give up yourself, what does that mean? Well, if self is some kind of artificial little boundary that separates self from everything else, when you remove that boundary, you haven't lost anything.
You've gained.
You've gained everything, right? And so let's have that in mind from the very beginning, because otherwise we're going to come right up to the point of realizing that there's nothing, that we become so aware of the nothingness in the middle of that boundary that that's what we unify with. So that's one of the great pitfalls. You can fall into despair. You could fall into it's an existential angst of seeing everything as meaningless and pointless, and it actually it has the potential to give rise to a kind of narcissism. With the dissolution of the boundary between self and other, what can happen, and sometimes does happen, instead of the self dissolving into the whole, the self can try to absorb the whole into itself. And therefore, as that boundary dissolves, then you all become nothing but something to serve my needs. The whole world, as a matter of fact, exists only to serve my needs, and it gives rise to a very narcissistic point of view.
Egocentric.
Yeah, very egocentric. And so it's very good to keep in mind where we're trying to go with this, that we want to come to the place of unification, of unity, of oneness, of compassion.
So
of
to get to heaven, you have to move through hell.
What's that?
To get to heaven, you have to move through hell.
That is true. In the Christian mythos, Jesus died on the cross, descended into hell, and
For
then
3
rose
days.
again. And it's part of the process. And we do have to confront that. In the state of unification, which corresponds to really stream entry in the Buddhist presentation, meaning this is the state where we've overcome the attachment to the ego self, but we still have the sense of being a separate self. There's still a further stage to move to, where through overcoming the vestigial habits of desire and aversion and the attachment to our separate existence, we eventually come to the complete dissolution of that very sense of being a separate self. And then there's no self at all. That is a condition that is incomprehensible before it has been experienced. And, so we can talk about it, but we have to be careful that we don't try to think that we've understood it. And the problem there is, once again, that if you try to understand that the complete and final falling away of the last vestiges of separateness, you're very likely, once again, to be confronted with just nothing but a void and an emptiness, a meaninglessness, and to shy away from it. Because your mind can't conceive of it in any other way. I mean, quite seriously, can you conceive of your non-existence? Have you ever tried? Most of us. I think most of us have. Anybody that knows that everybody else dies and intellectually concludes that, well, I suppose that's going to happen to me someday, has tried to imagine their own non-existence. And it's a simple fact. You can't. I spent a lot of time trying. I can't.
It's different than trying to conceptualize your own death, though.
Yeah.
It's different than trying to conceptualize your own non-existence.
Well,
because I have thought of death.
Yeah, you can conceptualize death.
But it never ends in non-existence for me.
That's right. Yeah, and it's a very beneficial practice to visualize your own death. To create a scenario, okay, I'm dying, this is what's happening, and work yourself through it. But the interesting thing is that we all are going to come to that point of discovering our non-existence inevitably. But as long as we are a self, we can't imagine not being. But you can get past it. I mean, that's what an arhat does. That's what a fully enlightened being does. Is they are dwelling permanently with every vestige of that sense of separateness. As it said, the desire for existence and non-existence both has been overcome. But first we've got to think about getting past where we're stuck in egocentricity. If we can replace the ego self with a sense of unity, of unification, of oneness, that's enormously rewarding. And then once we get to that place, the process of purification will continue on its own. So I think that's why let's focus on soul creation, even though we recognize that the soul that we create is not the kind of soul that we've ever imagined ourselves to be or wish that we would be.
Is there a danger in the idea of soul creation of creating just a better sense of self?
There is, and actually that's not a bad thing. That's a part of the path. If you create a better sense of self, if you now recognize that you are a self that has these flaws, these faults that impact negatively on other people and on yourself, you can imagine becoming a different kind of self who has overcome those flaws, and then at some point you will be a different kind of self. Now, the danger of using that as just a stronger means of attachment to the view of self, that's always going to be there. I mean, that's there right now. If you make more money and buy a fancier car and live in a fancier neighborhood, and you create a better sense of self based on all kinds of inappropriate values, but you can become very attached to it. And you can do the same thing in terms of, look how holy I am. Look how good I am at keeping the precepts. But of those two, which one's preferable? And which one are you going to more easily overcome? At least if you're on a valid path and you have an understanding of where that path is leading, even when you're experiencing your ego attachment to, oh, what a good self I've become because of my spiritual practices, the path is still telling you that you're going to this place, you're trying to go to this place of transcending the ego self, of being of loving kindness and compassion rather than of attachment and separation.
Okay. So it's a phase toward the enlightenment.
It's a phase towards it. But any time up to the point of stream entry where you have the actual experience of unification, at any point along the way, you are at danger of falling away. There is nothing to keep you from. And you could come to a particular point of feeling very holy and deciding that, that's as far as you want to go. Yeah. So, just as you can, to put it back in more ordinary terms, of basing your sense of self on the esteem you're held in by your community and the quantity of material goods and things like that. I mean, the greatest danger for somebody who has fame and fortune is that they become trapped by it. And their spiritual progress can be tremendously impeded by that point. So we always say, we never fully escape from these dangers until we've actually entered the stream. And once you've entered the stream, then there's really no... you can dally in the eddies at the edge of the stream, that's true. But once you've entered the stream, you're in the stream. Eventually, the processes of the spiritual state that you have come to are going to manifest through the progressive erosion of all of the remaining attachments that you have.
I found that as I've given up, I've showed you this year I've had many losses, and that I find myself drawn to other material attachments in spite of the fact that I realize how my attachments have interfered in such important ways with my development. Is the task just to keep struggling and being aware of that pull?
being aware, as far as the struggling part, maybe it's less of a struggle if you can recognize what's happening, is that your mind is conditioned. These old habits still, I mean, that's
old habits.
Yeah, they're old habits, and they've been repeated over and over and over again. And so they're going to be triggered by the same things, and they'll come up again. But if the awareness is there, that's the whole thing. The awareness wasn't there before. Now the awareness is there. That's the great gift.
That's true.
When the awareness is there, there's the choice. You can either forget what you've learned and succumb once again and further reinforce the old habits and let them begin to take over your behavior, or you can mindfully observe and recognize that, yes, I'm still conditioned that way. That's the way I live my life. But now I know better.
But then doesn't that mean giving up those things?
Not necessarily. It entirely depends on how they have come about, what you have to do to sustain them, and what use you intend to make of them. If the opportunity to acquire material goods or money triggers in you the desire to have these things for their own sake, or that you imagine they're going to be a source of your happiness, then that's not a very wholesome approach. On the other hand, though, if you and of course the assumption is here that the means by which these opportunities arise and whatever you would have to do to take advantage of them doesn't really involve any unwholesome behavior. So I mean that's the underlying assumption.
Yeah,
But if we take that assumption, here is the opportunity, then the most wholesome way to approach this is, how can I use this to further my own spiritual goals or to benefit others? And does it have a role to play in that? And what's it going to cost me? What am I going to have to give up in order to have that? Especially what am I going to have to give up in terms of my spiritual practice, the gains I've made in bringing about a transformation in myself. I'm on the path to a transpersonal state of being. Is this going to cost me in terms of that, or is this going to contribute in terms of that? Because if it's going to cost you, it might not be worth it. And if that's the case, well then yes, you are going to give it up. But it should come from a place of that kind of understanding. Once you've committed yourself, truly committed to yourself to a spiritual path, and most of this is only going to be minimally relevant until you make a commitment to a spiritual path. But once you've committed to a path of realization, then that is the light in which everything is evaluated. Somebody comes and offers you a great job with a lot of money. And you say, okay, what effects is this going to have on my practice? What effects is it going to have on my ego attachment? And so on down the line. And you decide whether it's worth it or not. And it may be or it may not. If you're not committed to a spiritual life, then you're going to think, well, what's this going to contribute towards my retirement? Or some other thought of that nature. That's the unstated premise of a lot of this, is that, and this is why the path of renunciation comes first, because you have to come to that place where you're convinced that no matter how well things turn out for you in terms of the out there, it's never going to really make you happy. That's what renunciation means. Doesn't mean the world sucks. does not mean that everything in the world is bad. It doesn't mean any of those things. It means, aha, I'm not going to be fooled. No matter how good things get to be out there, they're unreliable and they won't really make me happy, so I'm not going to get sucked in. That's the path of renunciation. Once you have achieved that understanding, then you are clearly committed to the only other alternative, which is personal development along a spiritual path. And then you have a gold standard by which to evaluate whatever circumstances that you find yourself in and that arise. It's either taking you in the right direction or it's taking you away.